It's Luke chapter 10, beginning at verse 25. And behold, a lawyer stood up to put him to the test, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law? How do you read it?" And he answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live." But he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem among robbers, who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now, by chance, a priest was going down that road, on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, 'Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back.' Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers?" He said, "The one who showed him mercy." And Jesus said to him, "You go and do likewise."
Susie, thanks very much indeed for reading for us. Please keep that passage open. We'll be referring to it in our time together now. You may also find this useful on the inside cover of the service sheet. Some points that will be made over the next few minutes together. Welcome back. I know a number are back from camp and many of us back from summer school. I've just been on summer school week 2, which is, I must say, like a parallel universe compared to week 1, as I know many of us were on week 1 together. It's a completely different feel. But I bring greetings from a number of church family who are down there. And yeah, it's really nice to see everybody back. Let's dive in. I think we've already prayed, so we'll dive straight into this really, really famous parable. Many will use this story that Jesus told to justify Christian social action. They will say that a careful reading must lead us to conclude that just like the Good Samaritan, so we also should be involved in helping our neighbor. Who is our neighbor? Well, it usually means anyone around us. What do we help them with? They would say usually, well, it might be anything. It could be social or financial or mental or psychological help, whatever is needed. We have some friends who work in churches nearby, and it was about 5 years ago, actually, in this room, we invited the people who work in the church just down the road, called St. Andrew by the Wardrobe, which is a wonderful name for a church, isn't it? It used to be the King's Wardrobe back in the day when the kings had wardrobes that were so big it took up sort of 5 houses, and that was the church that looked after the King's Wardrobe. And anyway, the new minister and his assistant came and had coffee. We wanted to be friendly, find out what was going on. And they described. We said, lovely to meet you. Tell us what you do. They described for about 20 minutes a myriad of activities that they involve themselves with, all sorts of things. One example, they ran a program called Suited and Booted, helping homeless people find a whole new sort of set of clothes, getting them sort of interview ready, get a CV done, and into jobs. Now, they're brilliant things, lots of great things. The whole premise for everything that this church was doing was the Good Samaritan. They said that is our justification for doing these things. Now, I want to be really clear. I think those are all good things, but I don't think that's got anything to do with the Good Samaritan. I don't think that's what this passage is about at all. Now, you can sort of be the decider as we go through this, but just look at verse 25. I mean, look at the question that's being asked here. This is what sets the agenda. And we've got to be careful about just jumping to the sort of the conclusions here. You see, the lawyer is asking a question. Verse 25, he's asking a question about how to get eternal life. That's the question that needs to govern our understanding of the parable that follows. I'd like to suggest that this is not instruction on church activity. It's not even talking to us about our own personal social responsibility. I'm not suggesting we don't have some. I'm just saying this parable's got nothing to do with it. Jesus is here addressing the issue of eternal life. He's addressing ultimately the question of how somebody becomes a Christian. So, in the end, what this must mean is this is not a parable about the lawyer's activity, nor is it a parable about the lack of activity that the lawyer has. I mean, it would be really strange, wouldn't it, if Jesus was encouraging this non-Christian lawyer to be really involved and engaged in good works and social activity. That would be quite a strange thing. How do you get eternal life, Jesus? And Jesus says, oh, go off and do all these things. That'd be a really strange answer, and that would stand in contrast to every other part of the gospel. Instead, what this parable does is teach us about the lawyer's state of heart. Now, you'll remember from our understanding of Luke, back in the beginning of Luke's gospel, it's very clear that Luke was writing to a young man called Theophilus. Theophilus, Theo, God, Philos, friend, a friend of God, probably a real person, certainly somebody like us in the sense of somebody who is a Christian, a friend of God. Now, Theophilus, in this parable, what is he being given certainty of? Well, he's not being given certainty to go off and be compassionate. That would be, again, to ignore the issue on the table, the issue of eternal life. Instead, Theophilus is being given eyes into the state of the lawyer's heart. And so I think that gives really important application for us as we consider what it means for us today. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to go through the text together and then ask at each point how that applies to us. I hope that's a helpful way of going through this. So you'll see the first point there on the handout. The lawyer, let's consider him. I'm going to suggest that he's quite an arrogant and self-righteous chap. I don't think you have to dig particularly deep to see this either. You see, right from the very start, there are some pretty clear indicators that this question that's being asked of Jesus is not sincere in the slightest. Lawyers in the Bible, they're quite different to the sort of lawyers that many of you are training or have trained to be. They weren't lawyers in the Bible, not into corporate deals or employment tribunals or any of the fancy stuff that happens in the offices around here, or at least used to happen 18 months ago. Instead, lawyers in the Bible were consumed of matters of the Mosaic law. 10 Commandments, all the surrounding writings, that's particularly the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, and their job was to interpret and teach and bring that law to bear on the people. That's what a lawyer did in Jesus' day. They would have been considered the academic theologians of their day, stuck in the ivory towers. Now, of course, you couldn't become a lawyer in Jesus' day without being an upstanding member of society. They held positions of authority and influence. And of course, they would have been above reproach morally. They couldn't have gone around being a rogue. And so all the more reason for Theophilus to understand what was actually going on in their hearts, the hearts of these religious theologians. And so if their job was all about teaching the law, then Theophilus had better have a pretty good idea about what the teachers around him were really like. And that is what Luke is doing here, exposing what these people are like on the inside. Arrogant and self-righteous, I'm going to suggest. You'll see that part of the first point. Have a look at verse 25. Behold, a lawyer stood up. Now we get perhaps just a hint at the arrogance and pride that sort of starts off this confrontation. You get it even just from the idea that it's a confrontational stance. Look at verse 25 again. He stood up to put Jesus to the test. You see, the lawyer isn't there asking a sincere question. The lawyer is trying to catch Jesus out. It's really interesting. Luke has used this expression, put to the test, one other time in his gospel. He's used it, of course, in the confrontation between Jesus and Satan. Just after Jesus was baptized, he was in the wilderness, and he was being put to the test by Satan. And so you see what Luke is doing here as he writes this. He's casting the lawyer in the same shadow as Satan. Another confrontation as this lawyer, perhaps we can say now more aggressively, stands to confront Jesus with this question. And not just arrogant, but self-righteous too. Look on to verse 29. It tells us what he was actually trying to do. He was desiring to justify himself. I mean, there is the self-righteousness. He didn't want somebody else telling him how he could be right in front of God. That was his job. He was the expert. He was the academic theologian. It was his job to go around telling other people what they had to do. And he'd throw a rule book in their face and say, this is what you must do. Well, we should think about the application of this first point. What does this mean for us? I think we have to be very careful here. Who does the lawyer represent? Done a little bit of work trying to expose what was going on the inside. Who does he represent for us today? Well, in Luke, the lawyers, they are all sort of part of a bigger group, the Levites, the scribes, the Pharisees. And collectively, this group of people, they pop up many times throughout the Gospel of Luke. They're a picture of human effort. We might call it organized religion. Okay, they were the religious guys. It's quite hard to find a word. Luke doesn't have one word that describes them all. Sometimes the word Pharisee is used, I think, as a collective term for them, or for all of them. I'm going to refer to them as the establishment. That's language we've often used here. Here's the religious establishment. And when we come across these characters, again, as we often say, it's worth just reminding ourselves, we shouldn't be drawing straight lines to us and saying, oh, well, we're a bit like them, or be careful that you're not a bit like them. That's not the point. You see, Theophilus, our friend of God that's having this gospel written to him, he wasn't in any danger of becoming like a lawyer. But Theophilus, of course, would have come under people like this lawyer's teaching. He needed to understand what the teachers around him were really like. Well, for us, what does that mean? I mean, the lawyer is a picture of this organized human religion. And it always insists, doesn't it, on how you can be right with God. I mean, the lawyer's question sums it all up in verse 25. What must I do? What must I do to get right with God? He wants activity that will give him a straight path to being right with God. And he's trying to catch Jesus out as he asks the question. The lawyer is a picture of, well, all the sort of religious establishment around us, the bishops, the imams, the rabbis. We perhaps could go to secular authorities too. Here is the HR department. Here is the local government. Here are the people that say, this is what you must do to be accepted. For those that care or believe in God, this is what you must do to be accepted in God's eyes. We've deified so many human institutions. This is what you must do to be right in the human institution's eyes. It's a picture of organized human activity. You see, as the gospel goes out, as the good news about Jesus and the gospel of grace goes out, there will be a conflict. There will be a head-to-head with the establishment. Theophilus is being prepared for that, even here in this well-known parable. It's certainly true in our time, isn't it? General resistance to the gospel. Well, it comes, in my experience, not so much from people on the street. As you know, we have lots of people that come in here every day for the coffee shop, people that we meet. They're not resistant to the gospel. They tend to think it's a bit irrelevant or untrue, but they're not opposed to it. The resistance, the hostility, well, that comes from the establishment. They're the people who say, this is what we can do. This is what we can say. They're the people that give us a hard time. And that's what we see lies at the heart of their heart. Arrogance, self-righteousness. And so even by the end of verse 25, Theophilus should be suspicious. Theophilus is being prepared to be skeptical of the teaching that he listens to. Of course, to be forewarned is to be forearmed, as we well know. And so here is what we, as Christians, as God's people today, should expect. There will be people around us imposing their moral grid, their social responsibility agenda on us. And we need to be careful about that. It feeds our pride. It feeds our self-sufficiency. It piles up guilt. And of course, it achieves nothing. Let's go on to the second point there. Jesus exposes the inability of religion. Jesus exposes the inability of religion through the perfect standards of God's law. Now, it's wonderful seeing Jesus deal with these rather scary characters, as I guess the lawyer in his day would have been. He's not caught out by the lawyer's question. Jesus deals with it so graciously, and he plays the lawyer at his own game. He uses a very popular rabbinic technique. He answers the question with another question. Have a look at verse 26. Jesus said to him, "What is written in the law? How do you read it?" It's a wonderfully disarming reply, isn't it? What Jesus is doing here is asking the lawyer about his favorite subject. I mean, don't we love it when somebody sort of homes in on our favorite subject? It's like if you bound up to Tom Bernardo afterwards today and ask him about cricket. You know, you'd better sit down. It will go on for some time. People love talking about their favorite cricket. Their favorite subject. I had a whole list of things here that I thought I might do and just sort of out you all with your favorite subjects, but it seems a little bit mean as I've been away for a week now, so I won't do that. Just talk to Tom about cricket if you want to take a couple of hours out this afternoon. And you see, certainly the lawyer, he's very happy to get chatting, isn't he? And he gives a really good answer, right on his favorite subject. Look what he says, 10:27. "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." What the lawyer does here is weave together a number of well-known Old Testament passages. And he says, essentially, well, the law teaches us to love God. With all your heart, it speaks about our desires, our passion. With all your soul, speaks about hopes, purpose. With all your strength, a reference to physical strength. With all your mind, a reference to the intellect. And by the way, slipped in at the end, you've got to love others as you would yourself. There is the perfect standard of God's law. And Jesus says, verse 28, here's the summary. Okay, having put out the perfect standard, the lawyer does it really well. Jesus says, yes, do this and you will live. But here's the thing. A moment's thought, and we will see it's impossible. You can't do that. I had this wonderful conversation. It was actually on that sofa over there with a really good friend. He's actually my cousin, a guy called Henry. Some of you will have met him. He and I have been reading John's Gospel now for, well, over 10 years. We've gone through it a few times. And he's asked a lot of questions. I think it's probably a reflection on my poor ability to read the Bible with people that he's still going in John's Gospel. Not a Christian yet. He wouldn't mind me saying that publicly, because he's just not convinced yet. But when we got to the issue of sin, I gave him this exact challenge. I said to him, look, if this is God's standard, then go and try it. Go and actually try it. He said, yeah, I think I will. And as we left the sofa and walked to that door, I asked him how it was going. And he said, yeah, I think I'm doing quite well. And I pointed out a few areas that he might have fallen foul of. And he said, yeah, well, that's a good point. Okay, I'll start again from there. And so it went on. The problem is, even if you could from this moment, what about everything from before? You can't brush it under the carpet. And none of us have a clean track record. It's an unreachable, impossible standard. And that's what Jesus is holding out here. It's off the scales. The problem is we come to Jesus, don't we? And we sort of assume normally that the standards are probably around here. And then Jesus comes and we think, oh, well, Jesus is saying he wants us to do something around here. Better pull up our socks and try a bit harder. But you see what Jesus is doing here? If we're going to use this sort of silly scale that I've just created, what Jesus is doing is saying, no, the standard is, well, It's a high jump standard that goes to the moon. You can never do it. You can't love like this. Nobody can. It's just not possible. And so the application of this point is very important. It's very straightforward, but of course deeply profound. It gets right to the heart of the Christian faith. Religion can't deliver. Religion cannot ever meet God's standards. It always falls short. And as Christian readers, we need to appreciate, to grasp, that even the most focused and committed attempts by members of humanity to try and get spiritual stuff, eternal life, remember that's the issue, to try and get spiritual stuff by human effort will simply never work. That may be worth thinking about a little bit more. That may be a new idea to some people here. It's worth discussing over coffee after the service today. If the issue is eternal life, and you could substitute eternal life for anything that you think matters within Christianity, it cannot be obtained by what we do. And so there is no solution here. Instead, Theophilus is being shown, he's being reminded of the problem. Theophilus needs to know that this is a slam door, a hopeless path. We like to go on holiday. I've told some of you this illustration before, but it makes the point quite well. We go on holiday often to the same part of northern France, and in that part of France we come across many roads that have signs up that say no entry in French, whatever that is, I've forgotten. But you know, sort of no entry signs, they're pretty universal, aren't they? And my basic sort of premise of life is that that sign is probably out of date and the road ahead will be clear and free. And I have two members of my family that think the same way as I do. My wife is not one of them, and one of the children is always with her. And they immediately say, "Daddy, what are you doing? Didn't you see the sign back there? The sign said the road is closed." And me and the other two children, we say, "Don't worry, it's fine, it's probably out of date, the road will be clear." And I think if Carrie was here, she would say, you know, how often am I right, how often is she right? I think she'd say, well, it's usually 50-50. And I think that's the sign of somebody who's usually wrong. So I think that it's pretty obvious who's usually right. And you can check that with Carrie. She's not here to defend herself. So anyway, the point is, every now and then Carrie is right. And there'll be a Frenchman who holds up a sign and wags his finger and sort of looks at me like I'm mad. What are you doing here? Didn't you see the sign? And that's the point here. The inability of religious human activity to get right with God. It can't make you right. You can never do enough. And actually, I like to suggest it's a very arrogant thing to think that religious human effort ever could. Polished, external, morally upright lives, they won't cut it with God. We've got to watch out for organized public religion. And it's not just that religion can't deliver. This is, I think, the most interesting part of this little parable. It's also that religion won't deliver. You see, religion is too stubborn. It's too determined in the end to follow its own path. It hates God's way, and instead it insists. All public religion insists on justifying itself. Look at verse 29 again. That is what the lawyer is trying to do, desiring to justify himself. He had his way was right, and he tried to impose it on Jesus. It's not just that it can't deliver, it won't deliver either. And that brings us to the last point there. Jesus exposes the reluctance of religion through the radical demands of neighborly love. This is where we really get into the parable. And I think this point is really, really interesting. Verse 30. Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead." Well, there we go. A situation of really serious need. And our attention is drawn to three characters. Each of these three characters a potential lifesaver for the man. First, verse 31, a priest. What does he do? We don't have to wait long. he passes by on the other side. End of verse 31. Secondly, a Levite. Levite, possibly a priest's assistant. Will he be any better? Well, there is little suspense in the text. We get a repetition of the same idea. He passed by on the other side, end of verse 32. And this may shock us a little bit. I mean, we often assume, don't we, that men, women of the cloth should be kind, compassionate. But Theophilus wouldn't have thought like that in his day. Priests and Levites in his day were not known for their compassion. So you see, Jesus telling this parable, this wouldn't have been sort of a shock to the lawyer. The lawyer would have been thinking, yeah, that's right. Of course they would have passed by on the other side. Why would they stop and slow their journey down and tend to somebody who might make them ceremonially unclean, or who might sort of prevent them doing their very important work of teaching the law? They just wouldn't take the risk. They would pass by on the other side, and the lawyer would have been deeply convicted of that. Their job was to teach, not to nurse. And so they would have justified their lack of activity. Verse 29, the lawyer desired to justify himself. And so the lawyers would have always acted together with the priests and the Levites. Remember, they're part of the same group. They're the establishment. They had the same mindset. And in the Luke narrative, well, Jesus is about to expose what he really thinks about this group of people, the lawyers, the priests, and the Pharisees. It's probably worth seeing. If you still got the Bible open there, just flick over to 11:52. Chapter 11, verse 52. This is where it really builds to a head. This is Jesus speaking. He says, "Woe to you, lawyers, for you have taken away the key of knowledge. You did not enter yourselves, and you hindered those who were entering." It's quite interesting, isn't it? Hindered those who... How did they hinder? Well, because they were reluctant to follow God's ways. Obviously, because they don't get it themselves. They were no use to anybody else either. They liked to do it their way, and they wanted others to do it their way too. They had positions of authority, they had positions of importance, and they chucked the rule book around. And ultimately, we as human beings, we quite like rules, don't we? There'll be mixed opinions after the last 18 months, but generally, people like to be told what to do. And I think that's probably where most of society still is. That's what self-justification is all about. They wanted others to do it too. And the parable that Jesus is telling us here makes this point in a really surprising way. You see, while the priests and the Levites have all failed, there is a contrasting character. A person that the lawyer would least expect to be of any use to anyone, a Samaritan, verse 33. Of all the people in the Jewish world, these people, well, they were really, really low down in terms of the respect stakes. They were considered second-class citizens by the Jews of the day. The lawyer would not have liked to even say the word Samaritan, which makes it all the more noticeable. The character stands as a really fitting contrast. Because, of course, the Samaritan didn't just offer aid. Look at verse 33. What does the Samaritan do? He had compassion. He saw. Verse 34, he went up to him. He bound up his wounds. He gave up his ride. And he bought him a hotel room. Verse 35, he used his own money, 2 denarii. That's quite a lot. That would have been enough for 3 weeks' room and board. He went above and beyond. The man's restoration was not cheap. And in the Samaritan, we have a picture, just a snapshot of the radical demands of neighborly love, generous, compassionate, and costly. Here's the thing, though. Remember who it's being addressed to. Would our lawyer have shown that sort of love? Of course he wouldn't. He wouldn't have dreamt of it. When Jesus asks, verse 36, which of these 3 proved to be a neighbor, the lawyer says, the one who showed him mercy. Do you see, he can't even bear to say the word Samaritan. It would have been like a swear word on his lips. Jesus says, verse 37. I'd love to know the tone that Jesus used in verse 37. Just have a look at it. You go and do likewise. But the lawyer knows, even if he had the chance, he wouldn't ever do it. He would just do exactly what his fellow priest and fellow Levite had done in the parable. He would have passed by on the other side. The reluctance of religion. And so the application of this final point as we draw to a close here. What Theophilus, our reader in Luke, is being shown. Religion is always resistant. It's always reluctant to follow God's ways. Eternal life is always and only through gospel ministry. And that's not popular in our world. We should expect the establishment to resist, to be reluctant to God's ways. That is the heart of religion. Religion wants to self-justify, to do things its way. And so as we close, what does this all mean for us? Isn't this just exactly what we always see around us? Religious systems, rules in place, pilgrimages and pillars, penance. But of course, none of that is gospel ministry. None of that is the gospel that is being spoken about in Luke. That's all man-made. See, any church activity that doesn't have the gospel at its heart. I've had lots of meetings with the establishment, in my case, particularly with the Church of England. We often share those sort of stories here, things that we're being asked to do by the establishment, by the Church of England. The meetings usually involve them telling us as a church that we should be dealing with the homeless, that we should be working very hard with local businesses on business ethics, and that we should be working hard on raising money for charity. And I'll have a number of emails every week on one of those three themes that come into my inbox from various people within the House of Bishops. People within the Church of England telling us how we should be spending our time and energy and doing absolutely everything except the one thing that matters, sharing the gospel. Here is the reluctance of religion. Theophilus needs to understand that was the normal situation in his day. Those were the people around. They were the people trying to guide and to pile up guilt. And for us, it's just the same, isn't it? We should expect it. Nothing's changed. There's nothing new under the sun. We've got the same group of people with slightly different names today. And we need to understand that religion cannot deliver. We mustn't be scared of those who tell us what we should be doing. And it's not only that it can't deliver, it won't deliver. It hates God's ways because it loves its own ways. And so it will do everything necessary to shore up its own position. And of course, within the Church of England, we're seeing a lot of that at the moment. In the end, organized religion is nothing but a dead duck, a blind guide. And so we need another way, which is why we have Luke's gospel. And what that must mean at this stage is that our focus must change. From the teachers around us who try to impose laws and activity to Jesus. That's really what this parable is doing, is causing us to shift our focus from religious works to grace, from the lawyer to Jesus. And so by the end, we're not really given the answer. What we've been shown is this dead alley. It's not that way. It's not with them. All eyes on Jesus. Listen to him. Learn from him. Follow him. Trust him. That's the only way we can go forward from here.